Okay. Yeah, is that all right?
Yeah, it's fine. We
Marvelous.
see it.
Looks good.
Phew. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you again to Emma for this lovely opportunity. So I'm going to try and give a kind of introductory overview, really, because I know that there's probably quite a lot of people who have different kind of mixed research interests and reading interests. So it's not going to be too technical, but hopefully it will spark up a few interesting discussions. So anyway, what I'm going to do this talk is first of all to think about the appeal for writers and filmmakers about space exploration. Why are we interested in that as a topic? And I want to think about some of the reasons for why we might want to leave Earth, to explore, to colonize other celestial spheres. And I want then to get more into the kind of history behind all of this. And there's two kind of traditions in writing about space colonization. One is a realist one is a romantic one. And I want to think about the appeal of those traditions for women writers in particular. In the last part of the talk, I'm going to think about space exploration in relation to women's movement of the 60s and 70s. And then lastly, I'm going to look at three contemporary novels from 2019, 2020 that reimagine the space program. So it's quite packed, but hopefully, as I say, not too intimidating. So then, this is very brief. Okay. People may well recognize this phrase, the Copernican shift. And science fiction has a particular interest in exploration of the worlds which are rooted into this so-called Copernican shift of the early modern period. For late Victorian thinkers like Sigmund Freud, like Friedrich Nietzsche, who responded to the implications of Darwinism, and this is a period when science fiction as a genre begins to kind of come into shape, as it were. For those thinkers, this Copernican shift represented the first sign of humanity's withdrawal from God's plan for his creation. So we have a kind of decentering, giving up and abandonment for Freud and Nietzsche, that we accept our own insignificance within the cosmos. Now, that kind of attitude is one which is characteristically modern. It's reflective of what the sociologist Max Weber, quoting Honoré de Balzac, would call the disenchantment of the world. So a sense of that the world has lost its magic, it's lost its inner significance, its deeper meanings, with this apparent withdrawal. But that's not the trajectory I'm going to follow in this talk, because a very important book of the 17th century, and one which I think we don't necessarily place as much emphasis upon as we should, is Bernard de Fontenelle's Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds from 1686. And Fontenelle was also responding to that Copernican shift, but rather than retreating from the center, retreating from God's plan, Fontenelle argued that humanity had found its humility, had found its deeper place within the cosmos. And so Fontenelle's book is based on a series of dialogues between a man and a woman. I think that's really important, that we have that female presence, that female voice in the text. And Fontenelle speculates in that book about the possibility of many other worlds, of habitable worlds that we could potentially explore. And he explicitly links the idea of aliens, of extraterrestrials with angels. So he sees this as part of a humility, as part of a divine place that humanity has within the universe. And it's that idea that I really want to explore further in this talk, that rather than giving up on any kind of design, we find our true place within the universe. So another way of thinking about Copernicus's intervention, and again I note that there was Aristarchus before Copernicus, and in many respects Galileo is really in terms of more important than Copernicus in some respects, in terms of the later controversy with the Catholic Church. But nevertheless, if we follow Copernicus' intervention, what he suggested was there was a possibility of there being celestial bodies which were like Earth, with a possibility of inhabitation. And that's what Fontenelle is picking up on in his book from 1686. And if you want to go quick case study in that. Mars. Mars is always a really good case study. Mars becomes a site for astronomical, metaphysical, popular literary desires for the possibility of life elsewhere in the universe. And until the 1970s, it was not uncommon for early cartographers of the Martian landscape to title observed features with names that describe their own heavenly utopian desires. Now, what I've offered here is a detail from Eugene Antoniadi's map of Mars from 1896, and there are a few names there which hopefully leap out of us. One is Elysium, one is Arcadia, one is Amazonia, and another one, if I can see it, is going to be, where are we? Oh, I can't remember which one it is now. That's annoying. But, you know, obviously Atlantis, of course. Obviously all names associated with classical, ancient ideas of heaven, of lost cities, lost paradises, of other ways of being in the world, like Amazonia. So these were very significant names that expressed not necessarily, you know, the Martian landscape, but they expressed the observer's own desires for that landscape. Now, there's a question here: is this an arrogant projection? You know, are we just arrogantly projecting our own desires upon that landscape, or is there a kind of humanistic hope that we're actually yearning after something that we can explore and hopefully attain? So that's, again, the kind of wellspring of desires which we're going to be looking at in this talk. Key text is Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon. If you want to think about how we get from those desires into actual literature, then Jules Verne is an absolutely key figure. The publication of From the Earth to the Moon, 1865, not only fed upon these desires for the exploration of other worlds, but also focused them. It channeled those desires. It gave them a shape and a substance. And it did. What was most extraordinary, arguably, about Verne's Voyage Extraordinaire was the extent to which it inspired real-life rocket research. So when we look at Britain and the formation of the British Interplanetary Society, all of those are Verne readers. When we look at Germany and we look at people like Wernher von Braun or Vlilay, again, they're Verne readers. We look at Tsiolkovsky in Russia, again, an absolutely key fan of Verne. And again, we can look at US and the formation of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And again, Verne is absolutely a key figure amongst their reading habits. Throughout the last quarter of the 19th century, writers and filmmakers who followed on from Verne infused the popular and scientific imaginations with a whole iconography, a whole territory of ideas of manned space flight. And so, again, you maybe want to look at people like Percy Gregg, Across the Zodiac, and indeed, Gregg's book was actually used for naming a location, I think, on the moon, if I remember rightly. George Griffith, Kurt Laswitz in Germany, Georges Méliès, of course, in France, and most of all, H.G. Wells, here in Britain, in novels like The First Man in the Moon from 1901. And all those writers, and there's numerous other writers and numerous illustrators as well, illustrations are really, really important in this period, all help to create this whole iconography, vocabulary of manned space flight, really infusing the popular imagination. So again, not a withdrawal at all, not an abandonment of the cosmos, as Freud and Nietzsche might argue, but actually infusing people with that sense of a place within the wider universe. Now, the only problem, or maybe there were many problems, but one problem in particular with these narratives is that very few of them are woman-centered. There is an exception, and that's Fritz Lang's film Frau im Mond, Woman in the Moon, of course, from 1929. Now, from that particular still there on the PowerPoint, you might say this is not a particularly realistic depiction of walking around on the moon. But in terms of the actual rocketry, the movie received technical advice from Vlilay. Vlilay, an associate of Wernher von Braun, Vlilay would then emigrate from Germany in the wake of the Nazis, and he would move to the States, and he then became a key figure within American pulp science fiction, in particular around the magazine Astounding Science Fiction, edited by John W. Campbell. Fritz Lang's film was written with Thea von Harbu, his wife at the time, and Thea von Harbu is a fascinating character herself. Positives, yes, she absolutely sends the woman at the heart of a narrative. Negatives, von Harbu would join the Nazi Party, leading to divorce, obviously, by Lang. Lang, of course, emigrated to the States. So Framond is one example. Another example, though, would be a film like Yakov Bozanov's Aelita, Queen of Mars, from 1924. When women did feature in these narratives of manned space flight or space exploration, it was more often as a love interest, as in, say, Edgar Rice Burroughs' A Princess of Mars, or as a damsel in distress, such as Del Harden to the hero rocketeer Flash Gordon. But in Aelita, rather more excitingly perhaps, extraterrestrial women are figured as femme fatales, and there we have Aelita looking particularly menacing on her throne on Mars. So you either have no women at all, apart from the odd exception, where women actually have agency, or they're often the love interest, the damsel in distress, or the femme fatale. So three very, very kind of caricatured representations of women within these tales of space exploration. There were, however, female writers of space opera. One would cite Lee Brackett, C.L. Moore, Leslie Francis Stone, all in the United States. But space exploration remained a male-dominated enthusiasm, typified here in this country by the British Interplanetary Society, comics like Dan Dare, and radio serials like Journey into Space. Journey into Space has an almost totally male cast, for example. Women are notable by their absence. And indeed, that might feed into some of the kind of comments made by some of the kind of key figures within pulp science fiction of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And incidentally, there we have a little picture there of the first meeting of the Leeds Science Fiction Convention in 1937. At the back, you'll note Arthur C. Clarke is standing a little bit sort of distant from everybody else. But Hugo Gernsback, who founded the first fully science fiction title in the States, Amazing Stories, is quoted as saying, as a rule, women do not make good science fiction writers. Science fiction was Gernsback's term for science fiction. Because their general education and general tendencies on scientific matters are usually limited. Isaac Asimov, a very young Asimov, writing in to one of the letter columns that Gernsback ran in his magazines, quoted as saying, when we want science fiction, we don't want swooning dames, and that goes double. If you know about Asimov's slightly dodgy hands at conventions, then that does begin to reveal something about his gender politics, I think. So although there are some notable women writers of space opera, more often than not, women are characterized by their absence and even by their outright exclusion from these zones of space writing, space enthusiasm. So that's part of the tension I want to explore here. Where do we fit women into this whole narrative? But we need to think about some of the more broad reasons about why we might want to leave Earth at all. I'll just run through these. We may want to escape. These are just things I was thinking about as per the presentation. We want to escape. We might want to be criminals on the run. I was thinking of a movie like Serenity or something like that. There may be, we're escaping from injustice, though, from pogroms or persecutions or discriminations, and we'll touch upon that in one of the novels I'll be talking about a bit later. There may also be self-improvement, education. Anidia Corfor's recent novella Binti is all about a young woman leaving Earth to find education at a kind of a sort of universal academy. We may well be escaping our fatal destiny, global warming, overpopulation, cosmic catastrophe, various novels about climate change or objects hitting Earth, like When Worlds Collide, for example. A quote from Stephen Hawking captures a lot of this sensibility. I don't think human race will survive the next 1,000 years unless we spread into space. There's too many accidents that can befall life on a single planet, but I'm an optimist. We will reach out to the stars. I think humans have to learn to live in space. And that's a sense where you can find again with R.C. Clarke, coming forwards to people like Elon Musk. So that, again, we have that kind of common sense, that sense of Earth is too precarious, too dangerous for those reasons. We need to find our place out there in the cosmos. Following from that, we may want to leave Earth to flourish. There are utopian aspirations. the desire to escape can also be a desire to start over again. We see that in a relatively recent novel, Emma Newman's Planetfall, for example, which is about the founding of a religious commune on another world. We may want to be trying to fulfill humanity's destiny in the world. There is an evolutionary sense to some of these aspirations. Famous quote from Tchaikovsky: "Earth is a cradle of humanity, but we're going to remain in the cradle forever." There may be a metaphysical dimension to this. Tchaikovsky was to some extent influenced by Russian cosmism of thinkers like Nikolai Fedorov. That still feeds very much into the post-Soviet space program. We see it there in the work of an ostensibly atheistic writer like Olaf Stapledon's Star Maker, or indeed in Clarke's 2001. We see it more explicitly in a religious text, such as Mary Dory Russell's The Sparrow from 1995. And then again, there may be political and economic reasons. We may want to see the frontier as a final frontier, as in Star Trek. There may be a notion of manifest destiny, of taking our place, of sequestering our place even in the universe. We see that in various kinds of works, whether it's more romantic texts, like Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, or more realistic, more cynical texts, such as Duncan Jones's debut movie, Moon, from 2009. So there are various reasons, but these reasons also then generate narratives, and this is what I really want to dwell upon for much of this talk. There are two types of colonization narrative in science fiction. One is romantic, I would argue, and in there, other worlds are exotic versions of Earth. Humans and aliens coexist. Humans in these narratives are often alienated from humankind, though, so these texts tend to dwell upon outsiders, interlopers, people who find comradeship with other species rather than their own kind. And in these stories, alien planets are a little different from the exotic lands to be found in travelers' tales, whether that's the tales of Marco Polo or the fictions of Baron Munchausen. Now, this tendency is perhaps best exemplified by the Star Wars story world, and in particular, the relationship between Han Solo and Chewbacca. Han Solo, of course, as an outsider, Chewbacca is his best buddy. And of course, we see it there in the cantina scene, one of the most famous scenes in Star Wars 4. But as we know in the cantina scene, it's predominantly a male-dominated environment. Where women feature in the romantic narrative is more often as the object of desire. Women are often eroticized, as in Barbarella, and there's Barbarella having a fairly pleasurable time with a kind of polyamorous android. Or they may be exoticized, as in, say, Cara Delevingne's pointy-breasted heroine in Luc Besson's dreadful take on Valerian. Do read the graphic novels. The graphic novels are much, much better. Valerian, the movie, is awful. Or indeed, controversially, Princess Leia in Revenge of the Jedi. We will gloss over that as fast as possible, I think. The other colonization narrative is a realistic one, and that one celebrates the colonizer triumphing over the difficulties of a hostile environment, taming it, accommodating it, terraforming it. This tendency privileges authenticity in terms of detail. It tends to be cynical about the historic mission, much more less manifest destiny here. And it tends to be developed outside the so-called golden age of science fiction, that period 1930s, 1940s. Examples here might include R.C. Clarke's The Sands of Mars, Heinlein's Moon's a Harsh Mistress, or more recently, Kim Stanley Robertson's Mars trilogy from the 1990s. The realist approach, however, tends to be predominantly male again, most obviously seen more recently in Andy Weir's novel and in Ridley Scott's film version of The Martian. There are a few exceptions. We may want to think about Jodie Foster in the film version of Carl Sagan's Contact, or Amy Adams in Arrival, the adaptation of Ted Chiang's story of My Life. But neither character in those narratives is your typical NASA astronaut. More usually, the woman is either one left behind, as in the film Interstellar, or in Michel Faber's The Book of Strange New Things, a very good book, incidentally, I should say. Or if the is taken on board, they are the spanner in the works. In Tom Godwin's archetypal pulp story, The Coldegrations, the female story is finally jettisoned. She's a threat to the mission. She's a threat to the ship actually getting to its destination, and she's finally chucked out into outer space. John Wyndham offers a more ambiguous but no less disturbing variant in his story Survival. Don't want to give away too much here. We have a pregnant mother. She survives. The men don't. I won't say anything more about that one. It's a wonderful story. So we've got two main traditions about writing about space colonization SF, a realist one or a romantic one, and they both tend for different reasons to exclude women. Both of these narratives, I'll argue, are embedded in a patriarchal discourse that either objectifies or removes women altogether. And to introduce a feminist approach would challenge this silence. There is a very important essay amongst many great essays that Joanna Russ wrote, where she remarked, there are plenty of images of women in science fiction, there are hardly any women. In another essay, The Subjunctivity of SF from 1973, Joanna Russ, and Russ is a key writer of science fiction within the women's movement in the 60s and 70s. In this essay, The Subjectivity of SF, Russ argues that SF represents what has not happened, which is not to say it couldn't happen. What couldn't happen is fantasy, according to Russ. And it's not to say that it isn't likely to happen. That's naturalism, according to Russ. Science fiction is somewhere in between the two. It opens up a possibility. So it's what has not happened, or what has not yet happened. Okay. And it's that possibility, arguably, which draws women writers to the genre, because it offers a counter-narrative, which is not simply escapist, but it has the potential to change politics in the real world. And so this is the real feminist injunction, as were, to SF. Quick counter of a few key texts from the 70s, during the second and third wave feminisms of that period. Naomi Mitchison, great writer, huge long career, of course, Naomi Mitchison, dating well back into the 1930s. But in 1962, she published her novel Memoirs of a Spacewoman, which focused upon the interplanetary journeys of a female linguist. And her mission is to communicate with radically alien species that are totally non-human. And so she has advanced linguistic skills, and she tries to create modes of communication with these radically alien species. So this novel that openly embraces ideas of post-humanity. We have alien sex, which is exciting. And there are radically new forms of social behaviour explored in this novel. And again, I always remember that this is Naomi Mitchison, who's actually about 63 when she wrote this novel. So I always find that really exciting, that an older writer could be so open to all of these really exciting possibilities. Joanna Russ, as I say, is a critic in science fiction, but an absolutely key writer of science fiction as well. And We Who Are About To, from 1907, is a vicious, darkly comic attack upon the idea of what literary critics call the Robinsonade. That's the narrative derived from Robinson Crusoe. The stranger, the loner on the island, who tames the environment, tames the locals, and survives. And Russ negates that whole narrative. And she negates that narrative in particular because of the way in which women are placed into that narrative. Women basically are just meant to be breeders in that narrative. And she refuses that. She denies that. And she denies the heteronormativity of those ideas, or of what Lee Edelman has called reproductive futurism, that we're just there to birth into the future ever on, whatever that future might be. So Russ's novel is a really dark negation of those sort of heteronormative ideas. Nicola Griffith's David novel from 1982, Ammonite, imagines an all-female community on a planet known as GP or Jeep. Now, what's happened here is that there were male settlers, and they all died off from a virus. The women survived, but the women's survival and their way they've adapted to the environment is regarded as an aberration by the company that owns the planet. And the novel then pits the struggle between the adaptation of the women to the environment and their liquidation, or their potential liquidation by the company. So again, we have a sort of radical lesbian separatist community being advanced in this novel. When you look at those novels, those by Mitchison and Griffith can be placed within the romantic tradition. They both celebrate the coexistence of aliens and post-humans in their narratives. But the alienation of the protagonist is derived from the position as women. Mitchison's future society claims to be utopia, but her central character, Mary, faces numerous pressures around work, marriage, and motherhood in the narrative. So it's actually not that utopian for her at all, really. In Griffith's novel, women are literally viewed as a virus to be eradicated by the men. Ross's novel, on the other hand, is written within the religious tradition. It's about the practicalities of colonization, but it introduces questions of gender and sexual reproduction, and it then negates the basis of that tradition. It argues that the whole tradition is about the exclusion of women, the use of women merely as objects of desire, as merely as breeders for the race. And she negates all of that premise, which leaves perhaps the figure you've been thinking about why have I not mentioned her so far, and that is Ellen Ripley in Alien from '79. And the curious thing about Ellen Ripley is that she wasn't Ellen Ripley in the original screenplay. She was written as a man. And her regendering came almost as an afterthought as the script went into production. Ellen Ripley is perhaps the most famous representation of a female astronaut within science fiction. But her gender ambiguity, that she is a woman, but she also has man-like characteristics, complements the sexual confusion to be seen elsewhere in the franchise, and the Alien franchises all the time playing with all sorts of kind of polymorphous, complexities between men, women, aliens, robots, non-humans, and so on and so on. To come to the last part of this talk, the last 10 minutes or so, in recent years, and this I think comes about as part of the kind of general sort of fourth wave feminism that seems to be emerging over the last 20 years. There's been a return in science fiction not only to the real tradition, but also the history of the NASA space program. Now, this is part of a broader, and here's a technical term for you, hauntological trend in science fiction. By hauntology, which is a term originally coined by Jacques Derrida, what we're talking about is reclaiming those narratives that have been abandoned or lost, or somehow slowly cancelled out. So it's about reclaiming histories that might have been and which could yet be. So that Russ notion again of science fiction is what has not happened yet, as it were. So that's where the hauntology idea comes in. Reclaiming histories that might have been and yet which could be. So writers have been influenced particularly by the stories of the Mercury 13, and there we have a little slide of some of the women there. The Mercury 13 crew were trained alongside the Mercury 7 men, but whereas the men got to be in space, the women weren't. The women were disqualified simply because of their gender. And then the other story to be very influential is, of course, the female calculators, as retold in the movie Hidden Figures from 2015. That slightly blurry writing there, but hopefully you can see Katherine Johnson in the middle. So these two stories have become very, very important for a lot of these more recent reevaluations of the NASA space program in fiction. So I want to look at 3 of these case studies to finish with over the last few minutes of this talk. So the most influential of these reimaginings has been that of Mary Robert Cowell, American writer. And Cowell began with a novelette, so somewhere between a short story and a novel, The Lady Astronaut of Mars, which won the Hugo Award in 2014. Hugo's is the big award given by fans at each year's World Science Fiction Convention. So this was 2014 LungCon 3 convention. So the story then inspired 3 novels so far, the first of which are prequels to that novelette and focused on the protagonist and narrator Elma York, a white Jewish woman. Okay, Jewishness is important in the text. The first novel, The Calculating Stars, again, that Calculating Stars, I think, gives us the clue there, the title there, won the Hugo Award for Best Novel, the Nebula for Best Novel, and also the Sidewise Award. Now, Sidewise Award is given for the Best Alternate History. Okay. The first novel, as that title, The Calculating Stars, indicates, is plainly inspired by the story of Hidden Figures. Okay. So these calculators will become astronauts. The alternate history premise is a particularly dramatic one. First up, Cowell imagines that Dewey became president, and Dewey launches a space race, which the US wins as early as 1952. But that's not really the dramatic moment of the internet history. The really dramatic one occurs when, after that, when Earth is struck by a meteorite. And the effects of this collision, so again, we go back to the idea of celestial bodies colliding with Earth, and the reason why we need to leave. That collision escalates climate change rapidly. Elma York is one of the human calculators, one of the calculating stars, and she's also a former US Air Force pilot, which is handy. It's Elma who estimates that because of the collision, the planet will be devastated within 50 years. Okay, so that human life will become inhabitable within 50 years. That sense of urgency drives the space race forwards. Since Elma and her compatriots' mathematical skills would be needed in space, they permitted his training for one of the very few places to found a base on the moon. What's tricky about that first novel is that though she does have a very diverse cast, and Carl will point to the fact that Elma York is Jewish, nevertheless, it is only Elma who gets to go to the moon. All the other women at the end of the conversation are still stuck on Earth. So it's slightly complicated, okay, I would suggest. The novel I want to look at, though, is the second one. Now, this is, the first one was mainly Earthbound. Its sequel, The Fated Sky, from 2019, is mostly set in space. But this time it's now 1961, the moon base has been established, and the next step is now Mars. As effectively poster girl for the program, Elma is selected to go on the mission. Quite controversial, somebody else misses out to make way for her. Back on Earth, though, or rather it's the US standing in for the rest of the planet. We don't see much else of the Earth. Tensions erupt. We have a group known as Earth First, who oppose the space program, who want the money to be reverted back to preventing climate change here on Earth. And there's also FBI investigations into the civil rights movement, which of course is still going on as a historical fact. This is a novel which is set firmly within the realist tradition. If you like your scientific detail, so if you're a big Kim Stanley Robinson fan, you will love this. There are loads of scientific detail as disaster met and then conquered out in outer space. The prose, I feel, is equally functional. Carol tries to give Elma's voice depth by emphasising her anxieties. She nervously keeps doing Fibonacci sequences in her mind whenever she's feeling particularly anxious. And she's trying to make her seem less of a Mary Sue. And a Mary Sue is like an all-perfect woman. But it doesn't really work. The characters are ultimately instrumental to the plot. It's very, very plot-driven. Another inspiration book was surely Weir's bestselling The Martian, which would be 2011, not 2013 there. And indeed, the novel comes blazing with a quote from Andy Weir. So again, Andy Weir's novel is stuffed full of scientific detail, as is this. Carol's twist in the novel is that her Martian is a woman, one of several, as it turns out, unlike the first novel. But unlike Carol's feminist predecessors, her novel is about inclusivity. Russ was all about negation. Carol's book is all about including, and that comes in the form of teamwork. So it's all about teamwork, collaborating, working together, even with men you don't particularly like. Elma worries about those who are left behind on Earth. Those include the socially, the racially, the economically disadvantaged. But she never questions the rightness of the mission, which I think is really, really telling, I think, in the narrative. She has a lot of kind of liberal guilt, but she still goes along with everything. My other case study is by Temi O, and Temi O is a very young writer. Temi O has just written one novel so far, Diudium of Terror 2, also from 2019. Unlike Carl's book, the plot doesn't really assert itself until later in the text. This is a book which is very strong in character. Temi O was born in Battersea in 1993 to Nigerian parents. She studied neuroscience at King College London, before going on to an MA in creative writing at Edinburgh University. Perhaps unsurprisingly, because of her background, it is a debut novel. Much of the action takes place around well-known sites in London in 2012. However, this is not the same 2012 as we experienced it in our real world. I imagine that space research had accelerated in the 19th century, and that by the end of the Victorian period, nations such as Britain and America had begun to put men into orbit. By the end of the 20th century, O suggests, most countries have established colonies in space as far away as the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. So this is another alternate history, okay, offering up a different take on the space program. Check my time. I've got a few minutes. Good. O is not adverse to scientific detail when she needs it, but her novel tends towards a romantic tradition. She never explains how this alternate history came about, for starters. There's a lot of acceleration space research, but certain events like Ed White's spacewalk, Neil Armstrong stepping onto the moon, remain fixed in time. Neither do the various space problems seem to have any effect on world history. All the other details of the 20th century, including empire, decolonization, remain the same. Okay, so this was a very romantic take on history, as far as I see. O's real concern is with the teenage beta team who've been selected with this in alphas to crew Team GB's 23-year mission to the exoplanet Terra 2. Despite the selection process, the betas squabble, they compete, they fight like any other group of teenagers until they have to pull together to save the mission. Looking at female betas, Juno is the perfectionist and political idealist. Her twin sister Astrid is a true believer. She's a new creationist who thinks she's going to be finding a second Eden on Terra 2. Polly is the working class multilingualist, a bit like Mary in Bichon's novel, but she's been chosen primarily for good PR skills. And then Aura, who departs narrative early on, is the conspiracy theorist, and she commits suicide on the eve of the launch, and that suicide haunts the rest of the mission. O avoids the pitfalls of Carol's single white-centric narrator, but her ending suggests an almost EDI agenda, as it were. It's marked by race, class, gender, disability. She skates over the imperatives of national prestige or ecological destruction. My last book, in the last couple of minutes then, is by Laura Lamb. Laura Lamb's most recent novel, Goldilocks 2020, is the most overtly political of these texts. Lamb grew up in California. She was part of a hippie religious commune, and she now teaches creative writing at Edinburgh Napier University. Her novels are YA fantasies, young adult fantasies, and then she moved to become more like cyberpunk, and all those novels are marked by a commitment to sexually diverse characters. Goldilocks is much more hard F than Lamb's previous novels. Like Carol Lamb, as an afterword, which she lists all the research she did for the book. Unlike Carol, Lamb features a predominantly female cast in which the heroine's anxieties, the highly symbolically named Naomi Lovelace, stem from a situation, not a characterizing nervous tic. But unlike O's character-driven novel, Lamb's is much more plot-based, so it's kind of in between the two of those other books. Unlike Carol O, Lamb's novel is explicitly feminist. By 2033, worsening climate change has led to increasingly authoritarian politics and women barred from the workplace. We have an entrepreneur, Valley Black, who effectively steals a spaceship in a reversal what happened to the Mercury 13 crew. The all-female crew's mission is to dock the orbiting space station on Mars before then using an experimental warp drive to get to the Goldilocks planet known as Cavendish. Whereas the political motives and costs of space colonization are something for Carol's Emlocks to agonize over, and for O's characterization students will debate, Lamb's takes as novel ideas, and there are well-argued discussions of utopia, female relations, and ecology. In this regard, Lamb shares a feminist writer named Alderman, whose novel The Power looked back to the feminist SF of the 70s. Unfortunately, Lamb also shares some of Alderman's political conservatism, in my view. Neither Alderman nor Lamb believe in utopia. They equate the idea of utopia with some form of oppression or violence. In the final part of the novel, I feel it turns more towards melodrama, and the eventual ending, although optimistic about space colonization, abandons the promise of female separatism for a curiously conservative heteronormativity. As with Carol, we see men and women coming together as a collaborative project. So it's a really strangely tense novel, I think. Okay, quickly wrap up. Some concluding thoughts. The recent Women's Rewriting Space program is indebted to both the realist and romantic traditions in SF, as I've sketched out, but it's also indebted to the feminist SF of the 60s and 70s and even the 80s. While female authors employ scientific and technical detail to offer space research, they frame this material within the social lives of their female and indeed male characters. Contemporary SF offers ways of thinking about and reimagining the human, as well as the technological and ecological possibilities of space exploration. But I think these more recent novels tend towards inclusivity, and it's symptomatic of the intersectionality of fourth wave feminism. But in so doing, they appear to lose the radicalism of their predecessors, like Mitchison, like Russ, like Griffith. So the question I want to leave you with is, can these novels be invigorated by the utopian or experimental narratives to be seen elsewhere in contemporary fiction? And that is a question I'm going to leave hanging for you. But that is the end of the talk. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Do the
so it's a bit much towards the end there, but there you go.
No, thank you. That was wonderful. You can do the slightly awkward digital applause, but I'm sure everyone else who was muted was also applauding.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was an excellent talk. So now we have about 15 minutes for questions. If anyone has any, you can unmute your mic and say it out loud, or you can type it in the chat and I'm happy to read it. Or raise your hand and I can go down the list. Emily.
Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for that. That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say something about your publishing series. That would be really interesting, I think, to everybody. How are you picking the books? What's the aim behind it?
Yeah,
how did this happen?
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I would say this is it's my co-founder, Una McCormack, well-known science fiction writer. Una had the started off, I think, between Una and Sarah Kemba, who runs Goldsmiths Press, and Una just took the view that that we just needed a new press devoted to feminist writing. This could be feminist writing by men and women. We're not sort of separatists in that sense, maybe. I am the token man, I have to say. everybody else are women. So it just grew out of that conversation between Sarah and Una then got me on board, and we then had a meeting. Basically, yeah, what we're looking for is writing that tackles feminist themes, but also within the kind of wider political context. So we may be thinking about ecology, we may be thinking about fascism or whatever it might be. The other all the other kind of things. Automation, the workplace, whatever it might be. And very intersectional. And we're definitely looking at sort of writing by both women and men, which really look at a whole broad range of issues, but definitely from that kind of woman-centered point of view. Ultimately. We've had a couple of open calls. We've got 2 or 3 texts that I think we're definitely going to be going with, I have to say. We're open to not just novels, we've got a poetry collection that we want to publish as well. And speaking personally, I would like to see some short stories. I'd like to see some short story collections, frankly, being promoted. But yeah, if you go to the Goldsmiths Press website, search around there, you'll find little links to Gold SF. We're on Twitter as well. It's the best way to find us as well, actually, there. So, and again, I could send out a link to Emma if you want to know more about it. But yeah, that's our brief. But yeah, we've got 2 or 3 titles in the pipeline, and we're going to be doing another open call a bit later in the year. So yeah, looking good.
Yeah, I'd be happy to email out some information about that.
Thank you.
After the meeting. Peter.
Hi there. You showed some really drastic examples of kind of gender imbalance in historical science fiction. I mean, from a purely men's club to some awful citations, etc. But how did that evolve? Would you say that this is still very much the case, or are we improving? For my feeling is when you think about more recent science fiction movies, that I don't see much of an imbalance anymore, but I might be wrong. I just, is there any data about that around?
Yeah, I mean, you got a couple of questions there. There's the whole issue around fandom. I mean, definitely fandom has diversified. It is, when you see that picture of from Leeds in 37, and it is an all-male club. It's certainly not the case. To be fair, actually, it never really was fully the case. There were women writers, like as I mentioned, there were people like C.L. Moore and Lee Brackett. Going back, even when Gernsback won a short story competition, and the one of the runners-up was by a story by Claire Winger Harris, who then did write a number of short stories in the 1920s, early 30s. But even by Gernsback, I was astonished by word. The runner-up was a woman writer. My word, I was astonished by this. There was always this kind of bias there, but there always were women involved in science fiction. From the early pulps. It's definitely become a lot better than that. There are still tensions. Again, one of the reasons why we've set up Gold SF is that there has been a tendency in contemporary publishing to kind of shift women writers more into young adult writing or into fantasy writing, and it, if you look at some of our key writers, people like Gwyneth Jones, Justina Robson, they've all been publishing, maybe it's like self-publishing and doing other kind of routes to publishing science fiction. So there are tensions there. If you're looking at terms of representation, in terms of novels and films, I've been a Clark Award judge, and there's some stinkers out there. Frankly, I don't want to not name no names, but there's still problems about representation of women characters, and films is quite tricky. I mean, you've got to go into that sort of thing of the all action female heroine, with an extra male chromosome or something, and there's a lot of those kind of characters, and I think it's a very tricky one. I think that there is representation, but sometimes it still ends up being quite caricatured as well. The person who's written a lot about this is actually Dean Conrad. Dean Conrad's book about space sirens and princesses. He does a very interesting study there, seeing the rise, and then not quite the fall, but the kind of sidelining of female characters in Hollywood cinema. And so I would recommend Dean Conrad's book to you, actually. So it's better than it was, but it could still be a lot better, put it that way, I think.
Yes, Eva has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. So I was curious if there's any science fiction book out there where people actually try to invent some kind of alien civilization where the gender balance is completely the opposite, perhaps.
Oh yeah, well yeah, absolutely. The classic one, obviously, is Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin, where you have an hermaphroditic alien species. Ian Banks' Play of Games, I would also mention, with the kind of third sex. The one to look out for most recently would be Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie from 2013, which kind of won everything when that came out, where you have all the characters are non-binary, so we don't actually know whether they're he or she, or even what these characters even look like, actually. So Ancillary Justice is definitely one to look out for, and certainly other writers are exploring, if it's not just with aliens, also looking at kind of non-binary characters. We see non-binary characters in the novels of Emma Newman, whom I mentioned in the talk, and I'm trying to think some other kind of really interesting sort of alien civilizations out there. There's probably some really, really obvious thing, and I'm just not thinking of it. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, definitely. If you look at Tade Thompson's Rosewater, which is Tade Thompson is a British writer, but again Nigerian ancestry, and his novel Rosewater and the sequels are really interesting in terms of thinking about through this very mysterious, enigmatic alien civilization. Again, we can't really pin down exactly what they are. They can be, radically alien, and I think that they're really interesting books to look at. So I recommend those to you. Yeah,
Right,
alongside Anne Leckie. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe as a guest you can't see the chat, so I've been typing the books you're mentioning in the chat. So there's a record of it for the folks in the meeting.
Yeah, again, I'm happy to put that in email as well. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other question, Christiana?
Yes. Hi. So thanks again for this very exciting talk. I think I couldn't scribble as fast as you were putting out all the interesting thoughts, books, and titles. So
it's pre-recorded.
Yes. You gave us a good overview about recent female writers, and I have the feeling this is as close as sci-fi as it can get, because if you think about writing, then people reflect often on what they know, and they do research on the science behind this. But there is little research on the science behind women and women leadership. So that means there is a real niche, which hopefully is not necessarily a niche, but a real opportunity for sci-fi to really create some forefront, pathfinding, whatever, positively society-changing ideas out there.
I think that's that's such a good response. And you know, talk about leadership. I mean, the thing that immediately strikes me, of course, during the pandemic, where you know, so many of the most successful leaders who've tackled the pandemic have been female. And I think those real life female politicians are giving, or should be giving, writers a real lead in terms of thinking, what kinds of characters could we feature in our fiction? Whether that's science fiction, whether that's mainstream literature generally. I think it's absolutely. I think there's you're right. there's a whole territory out there that writers can be exploring and then using in
I think your talk just made it very clear. Sci-fi is the perfect vehicle for exploring this.
Yeah,
but then let me very naively ask: is there? And I know Eva kind of asked this question, but is there already sci-fi literature in this direction? I really mean literature that explores new concepts. So not the old the woman has to do it all concept, but something really new, inspiring. You could also call it helpful. I think I'm really searching for inspiration for us as humans, as a group, as a society, as researchers.
Yeah, I feel like I've been a bit mean to May Robinette Kowal actually in my talk. Kowal is definitely an important writer to look at, and I think probably want to look at the third novel actually, which I've not yet read, but it's not Elmer doing the talking there, which is probably a good thing to say. But I think where Kowal is beginning to spread out her social landscape and to bring in different characters, and I think more diverse characters, and place them into those kind of leading roles. And I think Kowal's work, as it goes on, I think will develop. I have to say the other one. I mean, this is a controversial one because she's a real Marmite author, but I absolutely love her, and that's Becky Chambers. I love Becky Chambers' novels, I have to say, because for me, her novels are. I've had so many arguments about this with friends, but for me, Becky Chambers was not saccharine. I would argue that there's real nasty stuff happening in the background all the time, but she absolutely asserts. Not in a really optimistic sense. There are characters who are teamwork, but it's not just you're doing it for the team. The characters are really individually realised, and I love them. I would say Una McCormack, whom I mentioned. Actually, Una's own fiction I would also mention too, actually. But Una actually places Chambers on a par with Le Guin. She kind of sees Chambers as potentially the new Le Guin. That might be overstating it, but you never know. But yeah, no, Chambers I really like, and yeah, I think Emma Newman I think is really interesting, and I will think on, because I'm sure there's other writers I'm actually neglecting, but yeah.
I am personally a huge fan of Becky Chambers. I feel like the sci-fi genre can often feel depressing sometimes. Yeah, really. And her books, though, like you said, there are bad things happening in her books. They feel to me a bit like being cozy next to a fireplace. I love reading her books.
I suppose the other writer would be Cameron Hurley. Actually, Cameron Hurley should be mentioned actually as well. I think. But then again, I think you also need to be looking at writers coming from other cultures. So again, Okorafor, I mentioned Binti's a great character. She's a great character. And I would really, really emphasize Okorafor's writing generally. Novels like The Goon. And again, I think, looking at writers like Nemwali Sapal, people like that. So I don't think we should be sticking with a kind of a white Anglo-American tradition either.
Yeah. So if it's not too much trouble and you wouldn't mind, I guess sending. I feel like we're seeing a need for a reading list or something.
Yes.
Afterwards. I can pass it on to everybody.
I'm happy to provide a few suggestions. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, although the recording will be available. I think we'd have time for one more question if anyone's got one. If any students have any questions.
And so I'll mention to Emma. Emma's got my email. If you want to email me afterwards, like I'm too scared to ask that question, then feel free to email me. I'm happy to take any other questions later on.
Excellent. Well, I think that. Let me stop recording.
Cheers, mate.